Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here today for this webinar about fire stewardship, tribal inclusion, and protecting maternal growth forests in the Northwest Forest Plan. This is the second in our series that the Wildfire Working Group of the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance has been hosting over the summer. My name is Alex Budd. I use he and him pronouns, and I'm the alliance organizer for the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to do just some quick introductions and kind of opening the space, and then we'll get right into it. So covering 25 million acres nearly of publicly managed forest lands across California, Oregon, and Washington, the Northwest Forest Plan sets management guidelines for federally managed forest lands across our region. And as I'm sure folks probably know, currently the Forest Service is in the process of revising and updating the Northwest Forest Plan for the first time since it was enacted 30 years ago. Obviously, a lot has changed in all kinds of ways since the mid-90s, and the amendments to the Northwest Forest Plan will be setting the course for how our forests, federal forests, are managed for decades to come. So today we'll be digging into some of the key issues at stake in the Northwest Forest Plan revision, including fire stewardship, tribal inclusion, and protecting what remains of maternal old-growth forests. There's a recording of our first webinar, which was more of a basic introduction to what the Northwest Forest Plan is, how it came about, and if you don't have access to that already and would like to see that, you can just reach out to me in the chat, and I'll make sure you get it. But before we go any further, I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional homelands of the Multnomah, Clackamas, and Cascade Chinookan, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Cowlitz, and Molalla peoples, as well as others who have lived, traveled, and traded here since time immemorial. A few minutes down the road from where I'm sitting right now is near Chico Kiku, a traditional encampment and gathering site near the confluence of the Columbia and Willamette rivers in what is now known as Northeast Portland. As Portland was developed, the original inhabitants of these lands were forcibly dispersed throughout the city and beyond, including onto the Grand Run, Siletz, and Warm Springs reservations, as well as other spots across the region. Obviously, just acknowledging ourselves as uninvited guests on these lands can't do justice to the complexity and brutality of the ongoing history of colonization. So I invite all of us to continually make more time to learn that history and reflect on our place within it. These Indigenous communities who have stewarded these lands remind us that forest defense isn't just about preserving a pristine environment separate from humans, but about restoring reciprocal relationships of care and interdependence with the lands where we live. And that also requires justice and sovereignty for those first peoples of these lands, as well as solidarity with their ongoing struggles. A couple quick logistics. Please keep yourself muted. Helena with Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology is here. We'll be doing background tech support and monitoring the chat, answering any questions, logistical, technical questions that come up in the moment. We will be having a Q&A after we hear from Meredith and Madeline at the end. So if you have questions that you want to put to them, drop them in the chat, and we're going to collect all those and get through as many of them as we can in the latter half of the hour. Yeah. I think that's pretty much it. We're going to be hearing from two amazing folks. So I'm excited to welcome and introduce Madeline Cowen as the Grassroots Organizer for Cascadia Wildlands and a member of the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance Steering Committee. And Meredith Jacobson is a PhD candidate at the University of Oregon, a board member of Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology, and a member of the FireGen Collaborative, which serves communities by empowering Indigenous leadership and diverse young generations for a fire-resilient future. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Madeline. Take us away.
Thank you so much. Share my screen. Right, does that look okay? Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Alex and Helena, for hosting us here today. I'm really excited to be here. Like Alex mentioned, my name is Madeline Cowen. I'm the Grassroots Organizer with Cascadia Wildlands, which is a nonprofit based in Eugene, kind of working throughout the Cascadia bioregion to defend and restore the ecosystems in the region. I'm currently on occupied Kalapuya land here in so-called Eugene, and I'm excited to talk with you all today a little bit about the Northwest Forest Plan. So, like Alex did provide a little of brief context to what the Northwest Forest Plan is. And again, I encourage folks to check out the previous webinar if you want a little bit more of that context. But just a little reminder, this plan was originally originated in 1994, about 30 years ago, and it affects 17 national forests across about 24 million acres. And so it's a huge area that is managed by this really, really remarkable plan that was enacted following what is known as the Timber Wars, where there were heightened conflicts between the environmentalists and timber interests on how the national forests in the region should be managed. And so just a little timeline, what happened back in December of 2023, the Forest Service put out a notice of intent to amend this big, huge plan. So this is a really huge deal. And they outlined 5 different areas of where they are planning to amend this project: improving fire resistance and resilience, better adapt ecosystems to climate change, protecting maternal growth forests, incorporating Indigenous inclusion and knowledge to achieve better forest management goals and building trust, and to better support and protect communities. And it's really remarkable that 9,000 people submitted comments on that initial notice of intent for the agency to make this amendment through a draft environmental and eventual final environmental impact statement. Continuing on the timeline, what coincided with the Forest Service putting out this notice of intent and this kind of beginning this process of this amendment, there's also the Federal Advisory Committee that was formed it started in 2019, the process of figuring out who would be on this Federal Advisory Committee. And so simultaneous to the Forest Service working on their amendments and what they want that direction to be, they've also are relying heavily on this advisory committee. And so this committee has been meeting over the last year and having long, really in-depth conversations about the legacy of the Northwest Forest Plan and how it's going to move into the future. So they completed their recommendations to the Forest Service on July 24th, and that was so pretty recently. They've published their recommendations, and I'm going to be trying to touch base on just a few of those recommendations today. There's a lot in there. I encourage folks to peruse through that more in depth, but then the Federal Advisory Committee is planning on having another meeting on September 25th through the 27th. And folks are welcome to submit their own personal comments to the FOC at that time if you wish. Definitely encourage you to if you can. And it's a little bit interesting with the timeline. The Forest Service has been telling us, the public, that they were expecting to have their draft environmental impact statement ready for the public to review and comment on, and so we could see that in August, at the end of August. So we were like, oh, we can have this webinar in the middle of September and really get folks excited about what that says and help folks write comments on what the Forest Service has put out. They've since delayed that to October 2024. So we don't know what date in October that will be released, but that will have multiple alternatives and of directions that they might go for this amendment process. And in October, it will initiate a 90-day public comment period. And so the earliest deadline for you all, when you write your comments, will be December 30th, 2024, New Year's Eve, almost New Year's Eve. Or if it's, if it was released at the very end of October, it would be January 29th, 2025. So somewhere within there, we will have our deadline for submitting comments on this really, really important plan that will have lasting impacts for at least the next 30 years. So, and then I also wanted to mention, it's not just the Forest Service who makes the final call on how this amendment will go. the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is underneath the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, will also be consulting the agency on the different alternatives based on what values they represent. There's a lot of definitions within any kind of federal document, or when you're working within this world of policy. So just a reminder for folks, or maybe if it's not new, or if it's fresh to you, it's really important to understand these distinctions. A lot of these were established in the original Northwest Forest Plan, and it's looking like they will basically stay the same within the new amendment, but based on kind of what we've seen from the federal advisory committee. So we have our LSRs, or late successional reserves. This is over 7 million acres, 30% of the original Northwest Forest Plan area. These are lands designated for old growth and mature forest characteristics that are really important for the species that rely on those types of forests, namely the spotted owl, which is the most famous one, but there's other critters as well. The matrix is just under 4 million acres, 16% of the original area. And those areas are designated for essentially timber production to provide a sustainable supply of timber to local economies. That's what those forests are designated for. Adaptive management areas are a little tricky. They're managed similarly as the LSRs, and they are 1.5 million acres-ish, about 6% of the original area. Riparian reserves, those are areas that are managed for aquatic species and riparian areas, and that's about 2.5 million acres, 11%. And then you have the congressional reserve areas. So those are national parks, wilderness areas, things like that. And those account for a pretty big chunk, almost the same amount as LSRs, 7,320,600 acres, about 30%. And then I'm going to be saying MOG a lot. You've probably heard that a lot, and that just stands for mature and old growth. And there are varying definitions of what a mature forest and what an old growth forest is a little bit, but previously what was understood as mature forest in the original Northwest Forest Plan was those forests that were 80 years old and older, or around 80 years old. And then old growth is forests kind of depending on where they are that are older than 120 or 150 years old. So once you get older than that, you're truly old growth. Some more definitions, really important to understanding where the Northwest Forest Plan is and where it's going. And I'm going to get in a little bit to what the Federal Advisory Committee is considering and kind of what the critiques are there. So there's a lot of debate around what's designated as, quote, dry forest versus moist forest. And so this chart here is from the Forest Service. And so they've designated a list of the dominant tree species that you would see in a moist forest. And so that might be kind of what you would imagine is like, if you think about like the Olympic National Park, that's like the quintessential Northwest moist forest. You got your like western hemlocks and your big Douglas firs and things like that listed in that list. And then in the dry forest types have junipers, ponderosa pines, Jeffrey pines, and they actually put Douglas fir in the dry plant series, but I think that was probably because Douglas firs are just so adaptable to a lot of different moisture scenarios, and so but they can be found in both. And what is really concerning with how the Federal Advisory Committee has been approaching the moist versus dry debate is that they are really oversimplifying the management approach in the dry forest in particular. There's a recognition that it's not really acceptable to aggressively log those moist forests, especially in the LSRs, because they don't typically experience as much of a frequent fire regime prior to colonization, and they don't have and they have a lot of fuels and they have more moisture, so they're not prone to that more active fire regimes that you might see in a typical dry forest scenario. But what's happening, the way that they're framing a lot of this is again just really oversimplifying, and in a lot of the dry forest designated areas, there's actually a lot of mixed conifer forests that are really moist, especially in higher elevations, like in the Deschutes National Forest, for example, mostly considered a dry forest type, but also it has a lot of this important moist forest components as well. So that's something to keep an eye out for. And I included this photo of the Deschutes National Forest from Blue Mountains Biodiversity Project, of an example of some of the aggressive logging that happens there in that dry forest. And this was considered to be, an active forest management area that has only increased the fire risk, if anything, or increased opportunities for wildfires to spread with, big, huge slash pile like that, and removing a lot of the moisture content from that forest. So it's another distinction that is important to keep in mind. And going in a little bit more to how the Federal Advisory Committee is recommending how to manage these areas is, again, they have a pretty solid approach to managing the moist forest. I'm going to dive in a little bit more to that because it's not perfect, of course. This is a quote from the recommendations. So they're recognizing that science is always evolving and new methods of distinguishing moist versus dry need to be developed in the future. So they're recommending an interdisciplinary approach to distinguish between moist and dry forest stands. So I think that's actually a pretty good way to approach the issue, but it also is very broad. And so, and they've provided more specific definitions for moist forest, but they've left out restrictions on logging an older forest in the dry forests. So this is a chart from their recommendations. So they actually, for LSRs in the moist forest type, they recommend no timber harvest at all, which is a good thing. But then for those that are in the matrix, which is again the like timber harvesting area, they're also saying no harvest unless it was basically born between 1905 or between 1825 and 1905. So so they have more restrictions on logging those older forests, those that are born in 1825 or earlier, or 120 years of age. No timber harvest on those areas. So that's a good thing for moist forests, but they really need to have similar approaches for the dry forest types. Getting into another realm of the Fox recommendations, and specifically, coming to this with an approach about the mature and old growth forests and how those are managed. There's currently a really actually amazing protocol within the Northwest Forest Plan called Survey and Manage. And so this is a protocol that the Forest Service follows prior to a proposed timber sale. They have to survey for rare and threatened mosses, liverworts, fungi, lichens, vascular plants, slugs, snails, salamanders, amphibians, all of these tiny little special critters, as well as other specific species like the red tree vole, great gray owls, blackback woodpeckers, goshawks. There's other species. There's long lists, and it's amazing that the agency actually sends people out into the forest and looks for these tiny little special unique components of what really make up a forest. The forest is not just about trees, not just about the old growth trees, not just about how the trees are structured. It's definitely all about the whole entire ecosystem. And so this is a really cool thing that exists. And however, we have seen the agency, the Forest Service, not following the protocols as rigorously as they should have since the adoption of the Northwest Forest Plan. The agency has basically relied on organizations like Cascadia Wildlands and BARC or Blue Mountains Biodiversity Project, KS Wild, these other orgs, to conduct our own surveys to actually go and find these rare species and plants and things and make sure that they actually protect, they develop their timber sales in a way that protects these really important species. So it's concerning that the Federal Advisory Committee has basically put in this language that is saying take appropriate actions to remove or lower existing barriers to active management in younger stands and dry forests, especially requirements to conduct pre-disturbance surveys for survey managed species. So the survey managed protocol is robust, like I mentioned, and it costs, it costs a lot of money, and it hinders the ability for the agency to sell more timber in the timber sales, basically. And so they are trying to minimize, or the advisory committee is encouraging the Forest Service to lower the standards for survey managed, when in reality, we actually think that these need to be more robust and more thorough. And then also just noting here, in this quote here, they say younger stands and dry forests. So they're not distinguishing the age of the dry forest. And so that's also really concerning, because there's a lot of mature and old growth forests that are dry forests that have a lot of these really important species. And so that also need to have these rigorous protocols applied to them. Another area is within the salvage or post-fire logging. The committee is recommending permitting salvage with retention of biological legacy features like snags and downed wood within the matrix and the AMAs, which are the administrative management areas. And LUA is just land use allocation, regardless of stand age. And so that while it's important that they are saying that they want to retain the biological legacy features, they're not saying that they're going to protect all of the standing live trees, and it's still going to allow them to come into forests that may be burned in a mosaic and bring in those really harmful machinery to sensitive post-fire forests to do selective logging in those areas. And as folks have probably were following after the 2020 fires, the Forest Service took all liberties to cut down as much as they possibly could in the post-fire landscapes. And this is just one example in the Detroit district of the Willamette National Forest. Trying to not take too much time here. There's a lot to unpack in this, but there's also some more concerns for age class specifically. They are trying, so in the original plan, the age class requirements were no logging of forests in LSRs if they were over 80 years old. Well, now 80 years plus 30 years that it's been since the Northwest Forest Plan is 120 years. And so now they want to raise that to 120 years so that they can maintain that opportunity to manage forests under that would have already been managed in the original plan. I hope that made sense. But this is concerning. We think that the age class should actually remain at 80. across the board. I included this photo with some of the volunteers that I work with, aging a Douglas fir tree. It was pretty small. I mean, relatively small, maybe not what you think of as an old growth tree. But that tree on the right where Patty is leaning against, that orange thing in there, we measured it, it's 28 inches in diameter, but it's 140 years old. And so that one will be protected with the new 120 years, but there's lots of other trees and forests and that's a high elevation area. And so the tree is going to be smaller. And so there's other forests that are 80 years old or 120 years old that won't be protected if the Forest Service goes with these recommendations. And then again, the matrix areas, so areas that are designated for logging, they don't have any age limits on logging. And they don't make any distinctions between moist and dry. And so this is an example of a stand that I would classify as mature moist forest. And it's important ecosystem, and any kind of logging in a place like this will have impacts on that ecosystem and the species that rely on it. So I'm going over my time, sorry. Lots to say, but I just wanted to throw in a few examples of the current mature and old growth projects that are actively happening on Forest Service land, despite the Northwest Forest Plan's amazing work that it has done to protect a lot of the forests. But what has happened is that there's so much mature and old growth forest in the matrix designation. So forests that are mature and old growth that are open to logging with way less restrictions, and they're in the matrix. So we really want to see in the new plan these types of areas, these stands of forest in matrix, to be a pathway for them to be switched to the LSR designation, because these forests, they are late successional. They are providing important habitat features for these species that rely on them. So Divide Project and Callaway Project, both in the Willamette National Forests. These are just a couple of broad talking points that we're kind of hoping to see in the environmental impact statement and the draft one that will come out in October. And again, the Forest Climate Alliance, we're going to be pushing out all of these talking points to you all, so you don't have to remember all these tidbits and all the wonkiness involved in some of this. But these are just a couple of them overarching ideas: permanently protect mature and old growth for climate and biodiversity, close loopholes to cut out the cut, protect post-fire forests, adjust land use allocations, like I just mentioned, switching the mature and old growth that's in the matrix to LSRs. Ecological restoration can happen in overstocked plantation forests that were clear cut 50 years ago and have a lot of density. You know, some light and appropriate ecological thinning should happen in those places. And readjust the timber production targets. That's another really huge thing. The agency has these millions of board feet that they have to provide to the local economies, but those numbers need to be adjusted within the context of the world that we live in now. It's different than it was 30 years ago. There are other values that forests provide besides timber production, and those need to be considered. And really an overarching emphasis on acknowledging and just including the importance of biodiversity across the landscape. And yeah, those are just overarching things. And I'm going to let Meredith talk more specifically about the really, really important work for tribal inclusion and stewardship. So I hope that was helpful, and I'm going to pass it over to Meredith.
Thanks, Madeline. And thank you to the host of the event and for everyone for being here. I'm going to share my screen. All right, is that working for everyone? Great. Yeah, like Alex introduced at the beginning, my name is Meredith Jacobson. I'm a graduate student in environmental studies and sociology at the University of Oregon. I'm also a researcher and do organizing with the FireGen Collaborative. And I am a non-native settler living on Kalapuya land in Eugene. And I want to emphasize and point you to the FireGen Collaborative if you haven't been exposed to them yet. They are a program of FUSE, Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology. FireGen is an Indigenous and youth-led organization with a mission to serve communities by empowering Indigenous leadership and diverse young generations for a fire-resilient future. FireGen is led by Ryan Reed, Kyle Trefney, Bradley Massey, Ian Brown, Ilsa Stackley-Vogt, and Ayuthia Lapierre. And Ryan Reed, who's in this picture on the right, was appointed onto the Federal Advisory Committee and has co-led the Tribal Inclusion Subcommittee. And I've been both collaborating with him as well as others from FireGen to engage young people in the Northwest Forest Plan process. So I'll be speaking here on what I've learned from that collaborative work, sharing a little bit about FireGen's priorities and hopes for this process. Also speaking from my PhD work, which focuses on forest policy and settler colonialism, and just want to emphasize that the views that I'm expressing come from my own standpoint and positionality. But collectively, we as FireGen view the Northwest Forest Plan as a strategic opportunity to remove barriers for Indigenous cultural fire, land stewardship, and to support climate justice. So just a kind of an overview of some history. Despite the fact that the Northwest Forest Plan encompasses the territories of over 80 tribal nations, the 1994 plan did not consult tribes and excluded their values, knowledges, and stewardship practices, which have maintained these forests and ecosystems for thousands and thousands of years. And thus, Forest Service management continues to violate tribal sovereignty, perpetuates colonial violence by denying access to tribal members to their lands for cultural uses, including harvesting, hunting, ceremonies, and cultural fire. And as mentors of mine, Ron Reed and Kari Norgard emphasize, this impacts the physical, mental, spiritual, and cultural health of Indigenous people. Their work is specifically with the Karuk tribe, and I'll share a little bit more about that later. And here I have cited a series of reports on federal tribal relationships under the Northwest Forest Plan, which I encourage you to check out after this webinar with a lot more detail about how the Forest Service has not upheld their responsibility to meaningfully consult with tribes, to uphold treaty and other rights, and to move towards reciprocal partnerships that truly uphold tribal sovereignty. And so this amendment process is an opportunity to meaningfully move in that direction in a transformative way. I'll speak a little bit more about this later, but Indigenous science is vital to stewarding these landscapes and cannot be enacted without Indigenous sovereignty. So here, the left-hand map, which Madeline also showed, shows the extent of the Northwest Forest Plan area. And on the right is a map of tribal rancherias, reservations, and trust lands within the Northwest Forest Plan area. This map comes from this monitoring report referenced here. And the same report also acknowledges that Forest Service staff lack awareness and understanding around ceded and ancestral territories and their importance to tribes. So some of the Federal Advisory Committee recommendations are moving towards greater shifts in access and stewardship partnerships on off-reservation lands as well. I want to read this quote from the tribal inclusion recommendations put forward by the Federal Advisory Committee, which reads that an abundance of historical and scientific research shows that cultural practices and stewardship, including burning, tending, tracking, cultivating, and paying attention to aquatic species and wildlife habits and interactions, often through sacred ceremonies, have contributed to the establishment and maintenance of mature and old growth forest habitats, supported fire-adapted ecosystems, and mitigated impacts connected to changing climates and a history of environmental degradation across the Pacific Northwest. On the next slide, I'll show some of the sources that may be useful to folks who want to explore some of the academic evidence behind this statement. But I think it's really important to emphasize that in excluding and ignoring tribal leadership, science, and stewardship, the Northwest Forest Plan continues to perpetuate violence to land and people, and old growth of this region has always been tended and stewarded, including through Indigenous fire practices. The denial of these practices deny the human role in caring for a biodiverse web of species. And like I said before, as a non-Native person, I'm not an expert at all on traditional ecological knowledge, not here to share in that capacity, but to point you to resources. So I encourage you to check out some of these sources. I think we can probably find a way to share them to webinar participants afterwards. So I'll follow up about that, so you don't have to, furiously write them down now. But these are some of the sources that I find really useful for understanding the role of Indigenous stewardship in the Northwest Forest Plan region, and include Indigenous scientists and practitioners as authors. I wanted to share this illustration. I've had the privilege of learning from Karuk cultural practitioners down in the Klamath, including Ryan Reed and his dad, Ron Reed, as well as allied scholars like Kirsten Vignetta, whose illustration is featured here. Dr. Vignetta collaborated on this with the Karuk Department of Natural Resources for the Karuk Climate Adaptation Plan. And you can see here, it's a visualization of humans as one part of a web of many species, and it's emphasizing how Karuk fire management enhances the flourishing of a biodiverse food web, supports food abundance for many species, including humans. And you can see many different habitat types here. You can see, conifer forests, oaks, riparian habitat, and meadow, all of which have been tended by Karuk people. So as I mentioned before, Indigenous science can't just be injected into the Northwest Forest Plan without shifts in power, in decision-making structures that uphold tribal sovereignty and self-determination. And so many of the recommendations put forward by the Federal Advisory Committee aim to explicitly move national forests to uphold commitments and responsibilities, legal responsibilities to meaningful consultation, as well as to move towards partnership mechanisms, including co-stewardship and co-management agreements. And I kind of have here, like with the arrows pointing to the fact that consultation is the bare minimum. It is a legal responsibility, a government-to-government responsibility. Co-stewardship is an umbrella that includes many different types of partnerships and collaboration between tribes and the federal government. And then co-management is more specifically refers to agreements with shared authority and decision-making power. I encourage you to check out the Federal Advisory Committee's glossary of terminology for more detail on that, as well as this really amazing report led by Dr. Christina Eisenberg that also has a lot of great context about ecocultural stewardship and these governance frameworks that can enable that. The Federal Advisory Committee also is putting forward recommendations for the Forest Service to recognize and treat cultural burning as an inherent tribal right and responsibility. And so tribes should not have to seek out federal permits and permissions to enact cultural burns. It is an enactment of sovereignty, and this is currently undermined by federal frameworks and requirements. And so there's some really transformative recommendations in the Federal Advisory Committee's document that I encourage you to check out and engage in the public comment process to ensure that these are not watered down by the Forest Service as they move to the draft environmental impact statement, because I really believe this is an opportunity to get some of these meaningful frameworks and shifts in power in place on national forests. Lastly, a big part of FireGen's vision is to empower future fire and forest stewardship workforces, centering principles of Indigenous sovereignty, intergenerational justice, and worker and labor power in these conversations where those frameworks are not always present. And so we believe that the Northwest Forest Plan can catalyze a needed transition towards a fire and forest stewardship economy. And this requires intentional investment in building youth-focused and educational partnerships. The Forest Service has really tried to limit the scope of this amendment process to some of the categories that Madeline referenced before. But my colleagues at FireGen and I really believe that education and just workforce development are inseparable from these priorities. Young people will be inheriting the consequences of today's land management and the plans made today, and will also be the ones on the front lines enacting the firefighting, fire lighting, and forest stewardship labor that these plans entail. And so the Federal Advisory Committee has put forward some great recommendations around tribally led workforce development and education, increasing partnerships to implement place-based education in schools, and also to build fire training partnerships between schools and colleges, national forests, and tribes. There is concern that the Forest Service will ignore these recommendations or consider them to be out of scope. So if you are engaging in the public comment process, I really encourage you to consider pushing for these considerations and to acknowledge that fire resilience and climate adaptation are not just about resilience for non-human species and ecologies, but the intertwined social resilience that hinges on the well-being of people in their landscapes. And education and intentional workforce development, I think, is a really important part of that. So I think that's, yeah, I'll look forward to your questions after this. That's the end of my piece here. And I'll pass it to Madeline to just finish up with this slide.
Well, yeah, thanks, Meredith. I just wanted to remind folks that there's also another huge amendment process happening to all of the national forests across the entire nation in response to the Biden administration's executive order in 2020. So there's currently an open comment period on the National Old Growth Amendment, and that comment period ends on September 20th. So if you haven't already written your comment and submitted that, please do so before the 20th. It's super, super important that that the agency at large hears from as many members of the public as possible.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. That was so wonderful. And we're so excited to have you join our webinar today on behalf of our wildfire working group. Now I'm going to send some or speak out loud some questions that we've got in the chat. And this is just a reminder, if you have some more questions, folks, you can put them in the chat and I'll ask them to our speakers and they can decide, or both, who will answer or both can answer. But the first question comes from somebody about taking action. And is there a way to respond to the recommendations to the committee? Or should folks here just wait until the draft environmental impact statement comes out in October to take action?
I'll take a stab at that. I think that at this point, the advisory committee's recommendations are fairly set in stone. They will have another meeting at the end of the month, like I mentioned. So if folks had a couple words they wanted to put pressure on them with, they could certainly submit. You can submit a written comment. The deadline to do that is this Friday, the 13th. But I think that most folks should probably focus your efforts on what the draft environmental impact statement will say, because that will be the most robust and kind of the most finalized or close to final language that we'll be dealing with for the amendment.
Thanks, Madeline. And I mentioned this in the chat, but I'll say it out loud for anybody not following along in the chat, which is Wildfire Working Group, which is a group of us at FUSI, Oregon Wild, Cascadia Wildlands, and a lot of other partners are collaborating on a toolkit where we will send out talking points, draft comments, links to how to comment, social media images, and a lot of really fun stuff that we will send to your emails, everyone that registered today. So we'll alert you when it's time and give you everything you need to be successful to write comments related to everything that we talked about today. And I will ask another question, which I think for Meredith or for anyone who'd like to speak to it, but that prescribed fire and cultural burning are often conflated or confused for one another and talked about synonymously. Can you explain the difference between cultural burning and prescribed fire for folks and the importance of the two briefly?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And in a classic academic fashion, I will point you to the literature to get a better answer. The Good Fire report that I mentioned, both Good Fire 1 and 2 have really great language on distinguishing between cultural fire and prescribed fire, especially in terms of policy implications. I know that different tribes and Indigenous communities define and use these terms differently. My understanding from the Good Fire's definitions are that, like I mentioned, cultural fire is an enactment of sovereignty, is an inherent right and responsibility of families and Indigenous peoples, and is inseparable from their relationships to place and to land, whereas prescribed fire is usually used in a non-native governmental context with like federal permits and those sorts of things required. And so, yeah, cultural fire really requires that sovereignty piece. But I really encourage you to go to the Good Fire report, to the Federal Advisory Committee's glossary of definitions, and also that Braiding Knowledges report that I referenced to.
Thank you so much, Meredith. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, there's those links that Meredith put in her slideshow. We'll send out a copy to the PowerPoint, but I've read some of them and I highly recommend checking those out if you're interested in the topic of cultural burning and ceremonial fire. This next question is for Madeline, which is that old growth forest protections are led by scientific rationale other than for profit. What does industry provide as credible science to log old growth forests, if any?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually there actually has been a little bit of a shift in the culture within the timber industry. They really have recognized that it's largely culturally, socially unacceptable to log big old growth trees, and for a lot of different reasons. And they're actually not allowed to log those the big huge trees. We're talking like multi-feet big ones. On federally managed lands, there are size limitations that so they can't log those big ones. However, they are focused on trying to provide more allowance from the Forest Service to log those kind of maturing forests. Those trees are, I think I showed one of those photos that we had the age of. It's a 140-year-old tree, but it's relatively small. That's a really nice tree for timber, that you can make a lot of money off of a tree like that. And so that's where they are working to push open those loopholes and log some of all of those forests under 120 years old, which is really concerning because we know that those trees are the future old growth. Additionally, what happens a lot of the time what happens under that rationale is you're not approaching the forest from a biological or ecological or cultural perspective. You're just looking at, so by removing many of the smaller trees around one of the remaining big old trees, you're effectively harming that ecosystem pretty intensely. And that's what we see in a lot of the federal timber sales. They'll leave the one or two big old growth trees, but a lot of the next generation, those smaller DBH, smaller trees are gone. That was a little bit of a circle around, but I hope that made sense. But they don't, unless it's on private land, they're not really sending those big, huge trees to the mills.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Madeline. This next question is for Meredith, which was, if you know, what was typically the scale of cultural burning before colonization in the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a tough question to answer as it's a really broad region. And there are many different scales of cultural burning from different Indigenous peoples and communities. I guess what I would say is that in my experience and work with practitioners and scientific collaborations, that Western science is increasingly catching up to greater awareness that the scale is much broader than what has been understood by Western science thus far. Even if the burns are at a very local family scale in terms of impact to the landscape, I think Western science is catching up to understanding how immense that impact has been. And one of the papers that I cited, led by James Johnston, that was an interdisciplinary collaboration that included Dr. David Lewis, who's an anthropologist and Indigenous historian, references the impact of cultural burning and cultural modification of trees in the Western Cascades at a greater scale than what has been understood by Western science thus far. So encourage you to look at that and some of the other sources. But yeah, thanks for your question.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Meredith. And I'll ask the one last question, which somebody asked is there a way to help to comment before or influence anything regarding the DIS, or ways that people can share their values and concerns before it's time for the official comment period in October? Maybe Madeline can answer that, and then that will be our final question, and we'll talk about actionable next steps after you ask that, which will be a good bridge. Or you answer that, yeah.
Wait, I'm sorry, I was typing an answer to response on the chat. Could you repeat the question, Helena? Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Are there other ways for people to make their concerns heard or values shared before commenting in October, outside of submitting something for the FAC committee? Other ways that people can share with their communities, or comment, or ways that they can take action before the big action happens in October?
Yes, a great question. Yeah, there's more that we can do other than just writing comments. Writing our comments on this is going to be really important. But there's lots of other ways to have your voice heard. Hosting a dinner party at your house and talking to your friends about what's going on, talking to your other people in your community, your neighbors, your friends, especially those that live maybe in rural areas or close to national forests. Keeping this conversation going is always something that folks can do as advocates. Writing letters to the editor, it's old school, but it works, right? It's so posting our social media, all of these things. You use your platform that you have as an individual to boost this issue. And then maybe take, also I really encourage folks to actually go into national forest lands outside of the designated trails. That's what I do with our volunteers. We go into the proposed timber sales. We go deep into these areas that most members of the public don't go to. And it's super, super valuable and interesting to actually look at the forest with your own eyes and put boots on the ground and try to do that kind of work of understanding what has happened in that forest, and what will happen to it in the future. So little plug for becoming a volunteer with me, and going into these proposed timber sales on federal forest lands.
Yeah, thank you so much, Madeline. So yeah, there's a lot of ways to get involved. We're super excited to send you that toolkit out in the next couple of weeks, which will include how to comment, tips for letters to the editor, videos and images you can share on your social media, and ideas for how to bring your community together. So we'll have a lot of information coming to you then. And if you have questions beyond that, you can always reach out to us. And I just want to take a second to give so much gratitude for Alex for organizing this event with me, for our speakers, Meredith and Madeline, and for all of you for taking the time to come today. So if you want to give our speakers some love, whether that's with twinkle fingers or heart emojis or clapping reactions on Zoom, we just want to give them so much gratitude for their time and you all. And we're really looking forward to taking action with you come October and staying connected and staying plugged in. And thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, y'all. We'll be sending out the recording as well from this, and a bunch of the resources that Meredith and Madeline talked about and shared. And yeah, there's a lot here. So stay tuned for that. Thanks, everyone.